Well, thank you very much. Normally, when somebody gets up to give a talk like this, the first thing you say is, thank you very much for the kind introduction. But I actually have no idea what she just said. Just so you guys know, for what I just heard was Robert Murphy. Man, economy, and state. So I hope that what she said was at least true. Thank you. I want to also to give a sort of preemptive apology. I haven't given the translators my remarks in English so that they can, read it for you guys, because I don't prepare beforehand. So for those of you who are listening and you don't understand English, they may have difficulty. So it's not their fault, it's my fault. When I start talking about Austrian economics, I get very excited and I talk very quickly, so I'll try to keep it slow. The reason I don't prepare beforehand is because I like the remarks to be sort of a spontaneous order. And also, my goal when I come to a conference like this is to give the best talk by an American. And so what I have to do is listen to Peter Klein first, and then I make sure I'm 10% better. So that's, and I'm glad Peter was here for that one. So let me the thing a lot of you have been asking me during the breaks, the obvious thing is, oh, is this your first time in Brazil? And I actually say this is my first time in the Southern Hemisphere. And so you say, oh, well, how do you find it? And I haven't been out very much. All I've really been here is at this conference. So let me to sort of just let you guys know from the American perspective how the Mises Brazil conference, the similarities and dissimilarities between this conference and a typical American academic conference. So the first thing, of course, is the food here is phenomenal. We went to a steakhouse last night, and at this point, if I became a vegetarian, I would have no regrets. My life is complete. I've had enough more meat than any man deserves. Guido Hulsmann apparently is still there eating as we speak. He may come in an ambulance for Hoppe's lecture later today. They have his photo up on the wall because they just could not believe how much meat he ate last night. Another difference, a lot of you were asking in Sao Paulo, you say, oh, Dr. Murphy, how do you feel about our state-run airport? And you expected me to be real critical, but actually I loved the airport, Sao Paulo, because the security was very easy. I didn't have to take my shoes off. I didn't have a $3 million machine scan me and have them radio and say, how does this guy look naked? And this part is actually true. Most of the stuff is jokes, but Peter Klein went through and the metal detector went off, and they just said, "Go right ahead." They didn't even care. And if you think about it, it's because they're very rational. They looked at Peter Klein. They said, "He's not a threat." Even on the plane, he could pull out a machete, and the stewardess would be able to disarm him. So I mean, so I thought that was very rational as opposed to U.S. airline security. What else do we have? Well, these things, of course, are a bit different. We don't typically use these at the United States conferences. I feel like we're in the United Nations here with these things, that we should be discussing what to do about Gaddafi, not about capital structure. Another difference is the setup here. At a typical American conference, you wouldn't have these nice chairs. This more looks like Oprah Winfrey as opposed to, and I mean that as a compliment. I hope you should aspire to be. I would switch places with Oprah Winfrey if I could. Another difference, the elevators here, we have to use, I have seen this in the United States, but it's not too often, where you have to swipe your card to be able to go to various floors. And so this part's true. I don't know why. I have a PhD. I couldn't figure out how to do it. So I was in there, I swiped it. I thought it worked. I pressed my room, but it didn't light up. So I thought, well, that's odd. But then the doors closed and it started moving. So I thought, oh, okay, there's a lag. It's like monetary policy. Okay, this is fine. But then it stopped at the wrong floor and opened, and so I realized someone on that floor, had pressed the button. So I pretended like this is where I was going, and I got off. And there was some other convention going on, and people were looking at me, and I just pretended to, So I went back in again, couldn't get it to work, went back down to the lobby. So I was like a little child just riding the elevators. So I did it again. The doors closed. They went up to the same floor because, of course, it's very busy. So I walked out. Hello again, it's me. And I asked, there was an employee there, and I said, stairs? And no, Anglais, and he went to go get someone, so I ran away. And then finally, somehow, I just had to randomly wait until someone from my floor was leaving, and that's how I got up. Another thing, and this concerned me a bit. I wrote it down because I didn't want to, or I typed it in rather. I want to get the words exactly right. So there's a similar one in this hotel, but in the one in Sao Paulo, these were the exact words. So in English, on the elevator, when you press the button, and it says, "Warning, before getting in." All right. This is, and there's another difference. In the United States, people usually wait for the punchline before they laugh. All right, so it says, "Warning, before getting in, make sure the lift is on this floor." So I don't know, if that's a common occurrence in Brazilian elevators, but that's a good safety tip. You need to let foreigners know these things. Or now here, I don't mean to insult you guys or anything. This is, again, just the observation. I'm a scientist. I need to report these differences. So Americans, of course, they're very stereotypical. They are very elitist. And so when we think of Brazil, we think of jungles and gorillas, and and so I have to admit, it was a little bit funny when at the opening of this conference you said, "Yeah, the one speaker can't come here because he was attacked by a rattlesnake." I think you should next time just say, "Yeah, a supercomputer fell on his leg and broke it, and so therefore, he was working on robotics." And then I have one more observation, but it's a little bit avant-garde. I don't know. Do you want to hear it or? Yeah. Okay. Well, Elios, I'm a man of the people. They want to hear it. Okay. So it involves the toilet. Okay. Now it's not. Originally, I was going to do research about which way the toilets flushed. But I found something far more interesting. It's not in the restrooms by where they serve the food and where they're playing the Hayek Keynes video. But it's in the one by where the books are sold. So you should do some research afterward, the men, and you can maybe take a picture with your iPhone to show the women, because it's not fair that you miss out on this. In the urinals, so you guys know the word urinal. It's the male toilet. So there's a sticker, and it says "Automatico," okay, and it's showing a diagram of a guy standing like this, and it shows these things. It's Automatico, and there's two interesting things. The first thing is the guy is naked. Have you seen this in the things? Again, it's in the restroom by where the books are sold. If you want to go see this, if you take nothing else away from my lecture, you should do this. Go look at that. So that's odd, and so I don't know, if that's some kind of crazy events you guys have, these Brazilian theaters where there's people in intermission have to go naked into the bathroom. Because I would think you would at least wear some sort of footwear for sanitary reasons, but I don't want to judge. And then the other odd thing is the guy has no arms in the picture. And I have a hypothesis. I think what it is they're trying to convey to you that, look, for someone who doesn't have arms, use this particular urinal, because Automatico, you don't have to flush it. You can just walk away. Well, that's all I have prepared. I'll take my... I guess I'm supposed to talk about something about Austrian economics. All right, well, let me be serious for a minute at least. It's very, heartwarming, or I get very enthusiastic coming to these events, that it's not just the United States. I mean, for real, in the United States now, people are very enthusiastic about Austrian economics, about liberty. They're far more than they were before. People are getting really interested in it. I've seen a change. For example, I write articles for Mises.org, and 5 years ago, the sort of emails you would get about them, I would get from college students. They, "Oh yeah, my professor loves Hayek, and so that's why I read this. It's good stuff." But within the last few years, because of the financial crisis, the emails are coming from people who work at a hedge fund. And so it's not that they're ideological. They're coming to the Austrian school. They want to know what Austrian economists think about deflation, inflation. What do you think about QE2? Because they know the Keynesians on CNBC are crazy, right? That they know that those guys are just talking in circles, and it's not real analysis. So that's very encouraging. That we're definitely seeing some progress being made there. Now, I think you guys down here in Brazil are a little bit, it's behind in the sense that we started earlier in the United States, and so we laid the foundation earlier. But I'm just trying to encourage you that you don't know when it's going to happen. But, for years, and I'm relatively new to the movement myself, but for years, the people at the Mises Institute in the United States were doing this. I mean, you talk to Jeff Tucker and people like that. In the beginning, there was just a few of them in a little room, and they would get in the U.S. mail, typewritten or handwritten, someone saying, "I like this article by Murray Rothbard. Can you send it to me?" And they would go get the book and photocopy it, right? And then put 10 pieces of paper, staple it into an envelope, and send it to the guy, and they would think, we're making a difference. Now one person in the world has this thing. Whereas now, it's all online, and they get, I don't even know how many visits they get per day, but you see the point that they were doing that for literally decades, not knowing if it was going to matter, and then all of a sudden this financial crisis hits, and we had that huge infrastructure in place. And so when it all of a sudden, conventional people on Wall Street and elsewhere in the financial sector, when they wanted to go somewhere, or just typical American households who weren't into reading economic treatises for fun, not too many people do that, but when all of a sudden, if your retirement portfolio, your 401k, or your savings drops by 40% in 1 year, which is what happened to a lot of American households, all of a sudden you're very concerned, what's going on? And you want someone to answer those questions. And so it was fortunate that the Mises Institute had Human Action Online, had Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money, and all these other things just waiting there for when people wanted it, okay? And so it wouldn't have been fast enough if we had been waiting for that opportunity and then tried to get a bunch of donations and tried to get everything set up, we would have missed the window, right? So the point is it had to all be sitting there waiting when all of a sudden a rush of people needed to know the answers, and there it was for them. So I just would, again, encourage you guys, you're not gonna, how can I put it? Right now you have some idea of the difference you're making, but ex post, you won't even, the things you're gonna have influence, you won't even realize until after it happens. And they say, well, it's a good thing we were doing these. So again, I would just encourage you, and there are two trends going on at the same time. That in the United States, the federal government, of course, is getting more and more powerful. Barack Obama is worse in every respect than George Bush was, but since he's supposedly a liberal Democrat, he sort of neutered a lot of the opposition. The people who thought George Bush was a tyrant now are overlooking those same things because it's Barack Obama, and they were so enthusiastic about it. And the same thing with George Bush. There were a lot of right-wing free market conservatives who didn't object strongly when he nationalized the banks, whereas if that had been a Democrat who had done those things, they would have been calling him a socialist, right? So there's a lot that's wrong with the American political system, but what I'm telling you is at least the American public, a growing fraction of them are learning these ideas and becoming interested in it, and so it's sort of like a race, I guess, to see which force overtakes the other one, but certainly the things we're doing are paying off, so I would encourage you to continue with your efforts down here. Okay, so I'm supposed to be talking about Austrian and Keynesian business cycle theory and how it relates to the unemployment data or employment data. One thing I think it's important to stress at the beginning, and I think Dr. Hoppe is going to talk about business cycle theory more directly in the next talk, so I won't focus on that. But I want to point one thing out, that when you're addressing a Keynesian economist or you're having a debate, they don't even know how to classify the Austrian theory. And just to give you an example, when Paul Krugman, the one time he publicly acknowledged me, he linked to an article that I wrote for the Mises Institute, and he said, okay, yes, it was on business cycle theory, and he said, yes, this is theoretically possible, but what evidence do these Austrians have that this is what's going on in modern market economies when there's a boom-bust cycle? And then Krugman gave what he thought were a lot of empirical reasons to reject the Austrian explanation. So just for those of you who are completely new to this, so the Austrians, they explain the conventional boom-bust cycle in market economies. They say it's that in modern times the central bank will lower interest rates by pumping in more fiat money, expanding credit, money and credit, and so that makes interest rates go below their market level, right? So the interest rate is no longer serving its proper function of communicating how much savings are available to the economy, all right? Because the interest rate is a price that communicates information, and so if it's the wrong number, that messes things up. And so the Austrians say what it does is it sets in motion an unsustainable boom, and then at some point the boom collapses, usually because the central bank becomes more cautious and they stop inflating so much and the interest rates rise, and then the businessmen realize they made a mistake. Okay, so that's the Austrian theory. So Krugman is saying, well, yeah, that it's internally consistent, it's logically coherent, but empirically I don't think that that's what's going on in modern recessions. And one of the things Krugman said that in his mind was evidence for the Keynesian explanation and against the Austrian is he said, well, if the Austrians are right, why is it that the empirical research shows that central banks can affect real GDP and that central banking policy influences the course of the real economy? All right, and I mean, if you think about it, that's crazy. That he's, you know, I can't even think of a good analogy because it's so. He's saying if the Austrians are right, why is it that central banks can cause the business cycle? Right, and that's what the Austrians are saying is that. So that's the thing is that Krugman is citing something, so it shows he doesn't even understand what the theory is, and what's happening there, it's because in mainstream economics they usually classify business cycle theories as either monetary or real. Okay, and so they had this theory called the real business cycle theory, and there it's associated with certain people like in the University of Rochester and University of Chicago, and so some of those guys are very extreme in their views, and they will go so far as to say that the central bank, you know, can only affect nominal magnitudes, right? So they can only affect the absolute number that you put on price stickers, but they don't affect anything real, meaning they don't affect you know, how many hours of labor exchanged for a car. Or they don't affect how many tomatoes exchanged for apples. Okay, so they're saying all that the central bank can do is affect the rate of price inflation. They don't affect any of the relationships among other things. And so that's where Krugman's coming from. So in his mind, he thought the Austrians are talking about tangible machinery and things. So that's a real theory. And so therefore, the Austrians must believe that the central bank has no influence on the business cycle at all. All right, and that's why in Krugman's mind, if I can point to research papers showing that no, when the central bank lowers interest rates, that really does make real GDP grow faster for a few quarters, and when the central bank raises interest rates, it really does cause unemployment to go up. He thinks that's refuting the Austrians, but again, that's because in his mind, it's either a monetary theory or a real theory. It can't be both. And what Fritz Machlup said is that, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, I think, he said that the Austrian theory, the business cycle is caused by monetary forces, but it consists of real phenomena. Okay, so in other words, yes, it's the central bank pumping in money or not pumping it in as fast that influences what stage you are in the business cycle, but the business cycle itself is not just about what numbers you read on price tags. There are real distortions, that too much capital and labor go into certain industries, certain sectors, and then, you know, in the bust, those resources need to flow out of those sectors and go elsewhere in the economy. All right? And so that's why, in the Austrian view, it's the boom period where the mistakes are made, where the malinvestments are made, because entrepreneurs are misled by the wrong interest rate, and so you can't avoid there being a recession. That's impossible. The most you can do is stimulate even more and just prolong the artificial boom and make the necessary correction that much more intense. All right, so that's where Krugman was coming from, is he thought that the Austrians were saying this is purely a real thing and has nothing to do with money, but in fact, you know, the Austrians think that they have the proper theory, that it's naive, it's not just one or the other, it's that money is important, money serves a real function in the economy, it does something useful, you need money, but if you mess with it, then it's going to cause real disturbances, and so that's why you can't just fix things like that. You can't just institute the correct central bank policy and cure all the malinvestments that were made during the boom period, because there were, you know, too many resources went into housing, for example, too many went into the financial sector, and you can't just magically make those mistakes disappear just because you switched the correct monetary policy. So just to underscore that, I mean, you can't understand the Austrian position on various matters like the business cycle unless you understand Austrian capital theory. So for that, I have an essay, if you haven't read it yet, it's called The Importance of Capital Theory at Mises.org, so I would recommend that, you know, if you're going to read one thing based on this lecture, that would be the article to read. So if you just Google Robert Murphy, The Importance of Capital Theory, you'll hit it, and there's a picture of sushi near the top of the article, so that's the one, for those of you who've seen, that's the one I'm talking about. So there I give a simple little fable or parable about an island economy where Paul Krugman washes up on shore and starts advising them and misleads them, and they expand in some sectors, and they have a boom and then a collapse, and there's unemployment. And I have real numbers plugged in so you can think through and see the whole scenario. So that's what happens in that article, but it just shows you the importance of thinking through the fact that in an economy, it's not just that there's aggregate demand, that people go to the store and spend money, and then those goods are just magically on the shelves. That there's a temporal sequence that in order for you to go to the store with your purchasing power and for there to be a television set on the shelf, that had to have been produced in the past, right? Workers had to have capital resources, they had to have inputs, circuit boards, whatever, what the things you use to make a television set, the tools that had to have been accumulated beforehand. Someone has to drive the truck from the manufacturing plant to the store, and so on, right? And so these things, a mainstream economist would say, okay, yeah, sure, you need all that stuff, but they don't integrate that into their analysis, and that's why the Austrians say these guys miss the importance, and they don't understand what's going on during a recession. All right, now before I have 3 episodes here of where the Keynesians and the Austrians had disagreements about what would happen with the employment situation. But before I talk about those, let me just give you I don't know if you want to call it the epistemological foundation of this. So it's not that we're saying here, or that I'm saying, because the Austrians predicted better, therefore their theory is superior. Because as the earlier speakers were saying, in terms of the epistemology here, it's the Austrians are not subscribers to the naive positivist view that the way you discover truth in economics is by coming up with falsifiable predictions, and then whichever theory fits the data the best is the correct theory. But it is useful to point out that the Austrians, since we think they have a correct theory, they can navigate through the world more successfully than the Keynesians can. So just to give you an analogy, if you study geometry, you go to school and they're teaching you about the Pythagorean theorem and things like that, the method there is it starts with axioms, and it's logically deduced, and you come up with theorems. And if you understand how the proof works, it would be silly to say to your teacher, well, can we go test this? Let's go start looking at real triangles and make sure that it's true. If that's the way you're thinking, then you haven't understood what the proof did, okay? But at the same time, geometry is definitely useful in the world. If somebody is going to be an engineer and go build a bridge, and he says to you that, yeah, here's the bridge, you can drive your car, but by the way, I got a C+ when I took geometry, you might be a little bit concerned, right? So the point is, even though geometry is a logically deductive, a priori enterprise, I don't know if you want to call it a science, but it's a discipline of thought, it has impact in the real world, that you successfully navigate in the real world better in certain types of things you want to do if you have studied geometry. So it's really, philosophically, it's very interesting. It's almost like if you just sit in a corner and think, then you can go and be more successful. It's sort of interesting that that's the way the world is, but it seems to be that way. And so it's the same thing with Austrian economics. It's true that you don't test the validity of basic principles in Austrian economics by going out and looking at empirical data, but if you think through the consequences of the thought experiments that the Austrian writers discuss in their works, then I think that gives you a framework that you look out at the world and you can interpret economic data with that and be more successful. Another example, just so you understand where I'm coming from with this, even though the Austrian business cycle theory, you could think it through and say, yeah, that's a logically coherent theory, it makes sense. Krugman is right that even though it's internally consistent, maybe it's not what's going on in the real world. So that's another possibility. So it's not that we're testing to see if the theory is right or wrong, but maybe in the real world there are other influences, and that's what makes things happen that we conventionally describe as a bubble, or that we describe as mass unemployment. Maybe there are other things going on. So for example, probably when we look at the data for this last quarter, in Japan, their industrial output's going to be way down, and probably their unemployment's going to be way up. But that's not going to be because of their central bank. It's going to be because they got hit with a tsunami and the earthquake, right? So you can see that just because major things happen to an economy, that by itself, and that you think Austrian business cycle theory is correct, it doesn't mean every major disturbance is because of this particular mechanism. Okay, so that's why I think it's important to occasionally check and make sure, as Austrians, are we able to grapple with these typical employment data better than the Keynesians, or maybe we're arguing correctly about some valid thing that's really not that significant. Okay, so the first episode I want to talk about is when President Obama first comes in, and incidentally, I'm going to be dealing with the United States because, again, I'm a typical American. I don't even know that the rest of the world has employment, so we're just going to focus on U.S. data here, U.S. episodes. So President Obama comes in. It was inaugurated in early 2009, and at that point in the United States, the unemployment rate, the national average, and of course the numbers are bogus, but the official figures, the unemployment rate was 7% in change, 7.3%, something like that. And so they were proposing a major stimulus, because in a Keynesian framework, what's the problem? We have insufficient aggregate demand. So how do you fix it? Well, obviously the government needs to run a big deficit to get total spending up to create jobs. That was the Keynesian analysis and prescription. And so Obama's team, and one of the chief researchers on the team was Christina Romer, who incidentally was involved with Peter Klein's dissertation. What was it? She wasn't on your committee, but she was, well, an advisor. Okay, so you can understand, yeah, so you can understand Peter's Keynesian tendencies. So she's, but in all seriousness, I mean, she did have some important macro work, and then we were talking about this, that she did what she needed to do to get on Obama's team. But so she had this the model. You can go and see. I put this in a few of my articles to show you the diagrams. They're trying to convince the American people that, look, we need to have this $787 billion stimulus. I think the number they were throwing around at the time, which nowadays that doesn't sound like a big number, but back then that was huge numbers, as we've been desensitized with QEs and all this about these huge numbers. But back then, for the government, not because we're in a war or something, but just to go spend $787 billion of money it doesn't have, it has to go borrow to help the economy, and that was outrageous. So, and the way they sold it to the American public was they said, look, right now unemployment's 7% and whatever, 7.3%, let's say. If we pass this stimulus, unemployment will go up to about 8%, and then it will peak, and then it'll start coming down. If we do nothing, unemployment might almost get up to 9%. And can you imagine how awful that would be? People, oh my God, well, that's worth spending $787 billion. You don't want unemployment to get up to almost 9%. That would be inconceivably bad. So they passed the stimulus, and unemployment went above 10%, right? So let me make sure you got that it was around 7%. They told the American people, let us spend all this money to keep it under 8%, because if you don't, if we just let the free market run, it might get as high as almost 9%. They did get to spend the money, and it went up to like 10.2%. So you would think, surely the Keynesians will say, we were wrong. No, they said, it's a good thing we passed that stimulus, because otherwise unemployment might have been 15%. Right? And that's what they said. Okay, so you can see it's non-falsifiable. And it's a funny episode, but in fairness, that's the way economics is. There's no controlled experiments. I mean, you could imagine a medical analogy, and if someone has cancer and the doctor comes in and says, we have to do this aggressive chemotherapy or else it might spread over here. If we don't do anything, it might spread to your legs, and then they can go ahead and do the aggressive therapy, and it might spread to the legs anyway. And you can imagine the doctor saying, well, it was worse than we realized. And that one episode wouldn't disprove the efficacy of chemotherapy. It might just mean you had a bad doctor, or just legitimately they didn't understand how bad it was. So it's the same thing here, but the point is, the Austrian economists were saying, they weren't giving specific estimates and saying unemployment will be 10.2%, but they were saying, look, at what's going on here is the economy is recovering from the huge distortions that Alan Greenspan set in motion by pushing interest rates too low. Too many resources went into housing, into the financial sector. American households were living beyond their means, spending far more than their income justified because they were misled by rising asset prices. So the way you fix that is you just let prices come down, let firms go bankrupt, let resources get reallocated to where they should be. And if the government comes in during that process and borrows $787 billion and spends it on political projects, that just makes things worse, right? That's like kicking the economy when it's already injured, because you don't make the economy richer, you don't help the readjustment process by having politicians seize $787 billion more. Right, so that's the idea. So in terms of that one interaction, if you're going to evaluate economic theories based on their predictive power, you would have to say that's a point for the Austrians. But of course, the Keynesians don't say that. They still think that, in their mind, they're totally flawless. Another 2 episodes, and then I'll stop for your questions. So on December 27th of 2008, Paul Krugman had a blog post called Hangover Theorists. And I think most of you know who Krugman is. He's a Nobel Prize winner economist, very Keynesian, probably the most famous living Keynesian economist. So he is deriding the Austrian view as a hangover theory, because he's saying in the Austrian view, well, it's like the Hayek Keynes rap video, right? That the Austrians think that we're being punished for our sins during the boom period, which, it's not that it's moralistic, but yeah, there's just some truth to that. But Krugman's using the term to show how silly it is and how medieval and laced with morality it is, whereas Krugman thinks we have to be just technocratic scientists. So he says that he's got 2 main objections to this type of theory. So he says, on the one hand, so this is a quote from him, why didn't we need high unemployment elsewhere to get those people into the nail-pounding in Nevada business? So what he's saying is that if the Austrian explanation of what's happening during the recession is we had too many workers in housing pounding nails in the state of Nevada, because that's where the housing bubble was really intense, he's saying, well, how come during the boom years, during the bubble years, we didn't have high unemployment in non-construction industries in order to funnel all the workers into building houses? Okay, so there, it's almost so easy to explain that it takes you a minute to understand what his problem is. So he's saying, why isn't there a symmetry between the boom and the bust? But that's because, again, this issue of what the theory is, the Austrians are saying what happened is during the bubble years, the boom years, loosely speaking, the Fed comes in and starts handing out money to politically favored bankers and investment projects, so then they can go into the labor markets and start bidding more for workers. So wages start going up. So people who are unemployed start taking jobs, and then people in existing jobs quit to go take better jobs. If you can get a better job in construction in the year 2004, that's what you're going to do. Right? So you're not going to see the national unemployment rate go up. You're going to see it go down, because, again, the reason these sectors are expanding is because more money is being created out of thin air and dumped into those sectors. So that's why you don't see unemployment go up. But then when the bust happens, now all those expanding sectors realize we made mistakes, and they start firing people, laying people off, and those workers have to take pay cuts to go work at jobs that they don't like as much, and so people are reluctant to do that. And so that's why you see the ranks of the unemployed rise during the bust period. Okay, so that's why there's that asymmetry. It's because in the beginning they're just throwing money around that they create out of thin air, and so you suck workers into the new jobs by offering higher wages. Okay, and then Krugman goes on, he has another objection. He says, so again, he's writing at the end of 2008, he says, look, I'm looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and it's ranking states, U.S. states, by the rise in their unemployment rates over the past 12 months. And he said it's true that some of the states that had really big housing bubbles are high in the rankings in terms of unemployment, but other states like Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, are also high in the unemployment increases, but yet they weren't states that were particularly struck by the housing bubble. So he's saying, you Austrians or you hangover theorists, how can you explain that? If this is all about the economy responding to the mistakes of the housing bubble years, then why do we see some of the states with the worst increase in unemployment, being states that didn't have a particularly big housing bubble? So he's trying to say this isn't about the housing bubble, this is just about a fall in total spending. So that seems suspicious to me. Like, forget Austrian business cycle. The Krugman was saying the recession as of the end of 2008 didn't have much to do with the housing collapse. And so I was thinking about what his test there was, and so he was writing in the end of 2008, looking at the increase in a state's unemployment rate over the previous 12 months. So he was looking from December 2007 to December 2008, looking at those states that had the biggest increase in their unemployment rate, and then saying that wasn't overlapping very nicely with the states that had the biggest housing bubble and bust. But that's not surprising because the housing bubble didn't burst in December 2007, right? So what I did is I did a more accurate test. I said, let's look at from the middle of 2006, when the housing boom was at its peak and then started to collapse, from that point to the present, when I was writing in the end of 2008, and look at the overlap between states ranked in terms of, you know, how much did their housing prices collapse and how much did their unemployment go up. And there, if you looked at the top 6 states in both rankings, 5 of the states were the same. Okay, so it was only one state that wasn't different. And so, you know, if you were going to do that, what are the chances randomly that would just happen depending on how you frame the problem? It would either be 1 in 8,400 or 1 in 350,000. That could just be random like that. So, you know, it seemed like there was a relationship there much stronger than what Krugman had said because he wasn't really looking at the proper thing. If you're going to use the housing bubble to explain unemployment, you should look at from when the bubble burst to the moment in question. Okay, and then the last thing that more recently here, this last episode, was in August 24th of 2010. He had another blog post, Paul Krugman did, called Hangover Theory at the Fed. So again, he's hitting this issue in Krugman's mind. You know, so he's always just taking it in stride, never admitting, okay, yeah, the last test we did was a little bit wrong. It's always in his mind, you know, I'm surrounded by idiots. All these people keep saying these dumb theories, and we keep refuting them. So here, what he said was that, look, the question at the time was there was a Fed president, not an Austrian, but one of the Fed regional presidents, that was saying, look, the Fed can't fix these structural problems of unemployment because there are too many workers in construction that don't have the right skills to go over into other sectors, and so it's just going to take time to retrain them, and we can't solve that by printing money, right? So this particular Fed regional president was trying to say, let's stop printing money. That's not going to fix the recession problem because this is a problem about, you know, having the wrong skills. So Krugman didn't like that there. He's trying to make fun of it, and so the way Krugman thought he was going to look at the data to show that it was wrong is he showed a chart of manufacturing employment compared to construction employment. And he was looking at absolute numbers and showed that from the start of the recession to when he was writing in 2010 in the summer, that construction employment fell off less than manufacturing, right? So there were more jobs lost in manufacturing than in construction. So Krugman says, aha, see? If these hangover theory people were right, if this is really just about the economy responding to the housing bubble, you would expect more jobs in construction to have been lost than in manufacturing, but it's the other way around. So see, we're right. You know, this is about spending. This isn't about a particular sectoral adjustment problem. Okay, so the problem there from an Austrian perspective, there's 2 things. One is he was looking at the absolute numbers. You know, there are more people in manufacturing. So the fact that 100,000 people lost their jobs compared to 80,000 in construction, that per se doesn't matter since, you know, the percentage change is more interesting. But the other thing, too, is that the Austrians can explain why employment across the board falls. I mean, because the economy is poor. And that's what I'm talking about, the importance of capital theory. It's not, the Austrians aren't just saying, oh, there's spending here, and now because interest rates are more correct, the spending patterns shift, and so everything just magically changes. No, we made malinvestments. Capital got misallocated, and so the economy, we are genuinely poorer than we otherwise would be. So that's why you have this general fall in the standard of living. And so what I did is I looked at the index, and also I disaggregated it. So I looked at construction, durable manufacturing, non-durable manufacturing, and retail. And so in the Austrian view, you would the interest rate has to do with time. And so you would think that the lower interest rate would stimulate construction more than manufacturing because construction is like a higher order, a longer term thing. And then within the manufacturing sector, the interest rate would stimulate durable more than non-durable. And then the thing that would respond the least would be retail, because that's, you know, closer to consumption, for those of you who are familiar with these, with Austrian capital theory. And when you go and plot it, I mean, it's exactly like what you would have wanted. Like if you were doing a textbook, you might want to include the chart because it's beautiful that from the start of the collapse of the boom to present when I was writing this in 2010, construction fell the most, and it was the deepest trough, and then it slowly responded. Durable manufacturing fell the next hardest and then responded after a lag, and then non-durable the next, and retail fell the least. Okay, so it was, disaggregating it across those sectors, they responded exactly the way you would want if you thought this had to do with interest rates and how the interest rate affects different sectors based on, how durable they are or how much time they involve, which is exactly what the Austrian theory predicted. Whereas if you're trying to explain the recession and just say, yeah, people just aren't spending enough because they're afraid and total spending is down, there's no reason why would total spending in construction be down more than in non-durable manufacturing, and why would, among the manufacturing, why would it matter whether it was durable or non-durable if it's just spending is down? And furthermore, you would think that if anything, retail might fall more since the transmission is from people, not spending enough, from consumers not spending enough. You would think retail would fall first, and then everything else would respond, right? So anyway, the point is just these three areas where the Keynesians were the ones who, sort of picked these criteria and said, aha, see, we're better than the Austrians on this. When you went and looked at the data, you said, well, no, actually, the Austrians are better. So I think in terms of the standard scientific method, I mean, that's really a strong test when the opponents of the theory set up the criteria, and then it turns out upon closer inspection, well, no, actually, the Austrians are better on that. So with that, I will stop there, and I'll take your questions.
Hello, I'm Eric Duarte, and I'd like to ask you, do you think that Paul Krugman, he doesn't understand the theory of the business cycle? That's why he says a lot of silly things like he does? Or you think that he's just dishonest and paid off by government and he's paid off to say all this bullshit?
He doesn't spend that much time studying. I mean, in the past, he has referred to the Austrian theory as equivalent to the phlogiston theory of fire, right? Which is, discredited, from the ancient Greeks or something. So he thinks it's very silly. And like I said, the comment he made saying, well, if the Austrian theory is right, why does the research show that central banks can influence the business cycle, which, is the Austrian theory? So just remarks like, I mean, that shows more ignorance than malice. That if you were just lying, you would do a better job of it, right? So again, he's not stupid. I mean, there's a lot of things you could say about him, and people say, "So are these guys stupid or evil?" And I say, "Well, they're not stupid," and then I just pause. But he is really cocky. I think in his mind he's right, and that's why he can be so arrogant about it, because in his mind he's right, and he's trying to help the little guy, and he thinks that we're paid off by big business.
Thank you.
There's a question here. How media will give, how repercutir, me fugiu. Well, how media will treat the facts of your debate with Paul Krugman? How could be the results on media of your debate with Paul Krugman?
Okay, yeah, so she's, in case, for those of you who don't know, I have a debate with Paul Krugman, and if you go to krugmandebate.com, you can see the silly videos I've made. So we've raised $65,000. I have a few more funny ideas. I think we'll bring in more pledges that I've been busy on and make those. If it gets above 100,000, then I think I can get the food bank to do a press release, to say, hey, Dr. Krugman, we could use $100,000, why don't you? So that's the thing. Also, just on that, again, this is nothing. This is official, but it's conceivable to me that if it ever did happen, it might be because, I got somebody who was willing to, a promoter, to put up the event and sell tickets and so forth, and the DVDs, and then maybe that person could afford to pay Krugman, So there it'd be really difficult for him to turn down, the money going to the food bank, and then if someone's going to offer him a bunch of money. So if it were to happen, it would probably be along those lines. But as for right now, we do have some more funny videos in store.
We have another question. The joblessness has getting down recently in the United States. Do you think that you have a new moment again?
Yeah, again, it's a tough question. I think Peter was saying, the Austrians are very reluctant to make specific predictions because we don't want to be wrong. But it certainly seems to me like there is an artificial bubble. So in other words, I think the U.S. economy right now is so bad that this is the boom period, even as bad as it looks. That just shows you how far down the baseline was. So yeah, the uptick in the unemployment, so the increase in employment figures, I think is not a long-term trend. For sure, I don't think that we're just going to gradually grow out of this and the unemployment is going to recede and we'll just be back to regular times and that the monetary base is going to shrink and nothing will happen. So I don't know when it's going to hit or what's going to happen, but I do think, for example, that the stock market's going to crash. Like if you look at a chart of the U.S. stock market, I'm not saying the Brazilian, but the U.S. stock market, from your perspective, it goes way up in the late 90s, crashes, then up again, then crashes, and now it's like, about halfway retracing that last one. So to me, it's not going to surprise me if it goes up and then crashes, because when it's been rising, it's been because of the QE1 and QE2. So to me, this so-called recovery looks completely artificial, and I think if they stopped all the stimulus, it would all fall out again. And so it's, so yeah, the increase in the employment figures, I think, is a temporary thing.
Ali tem uma pergunta.
The question is about people and media expect that economists make forecasts. As the economic school can't do this, do you think that this is something that will make, that never made the Austrian school something that will be the mainstream, because it's not our business to make the forecast? Then we will not be in the newspaper.
Well, and again, that's partly what I was doing with this presentation is, I'm of the various people associated with the Mises Institute in the United States, I deal with the empirical data a lot more. And so it's like Peter Schiff, for example. I mean, we all love the fact that you can go, Peter Schiff was right, and see him calling the housing bubble and, all those other people looking wrong. And so it's good that he did that, and it gives credibility to the Austrian school, the fact that we were against the Obama stimulus package, and then look what happened. And so these things look good. So, does that mean the Austrians should therefore be building quantitative models and saying we think in third quarter 2013 this is going to happen? Probably not, but I do think the Austrians can see long-term trends or certain macro events better than Keynesian economists. Just if for no other reason, I mean, our views are so different. If the Keynesians think that this stimulus package is going to improve things and we think it's going to make it worse, I mean, that's a pretty big divergence that you can certainly distinguish your outlook from the Keynesian.
I just want to understand something that you said a little bit better. You said that instead of having after the housing bubble, instead of letting the government have the stimulus, you should let the free market rearrange itself by himself. And how does that work? How does that process work?
Well, it would. If the Fed and the federal government hadn't done anything, it would have been really bad for probably 6 months. So housing prices would have come way down. There would have been outright price deflation. That CPI probably would have dropped maybe even 10%. A lot of financial firms would have gone bankrupt, but it would have bottomed out, and then the benefit would have been the people that made the worst mistakes during the boom would no longer have any influence over resources. Whereas right now, the same 100 guys that were responsible for the credit problem during the bubble years are still basically in charge of the U.S. financial sector. So, that, they didn't learn anything, and it's the same people running the show. So the thing is, real wealth is not destroyed just because of falling asset prices per se. And so it's just a rearrangement of the ownership of the stuff. And so I think it just would have transferred ownership away from the people who made the worst mistakes, whereas now what happened is the people who made the mistakes were bailed out and the losses were spread among everybody.
Hi. Talking a little bit about the United States crisis that you were talking about, given the fact that we live in a kind of a Keynesian era, and given the fact that the college students are like studying the status quo of the government and everything, if you were the senior advisor to the President Obama during the period of the crisis, what would you tell him to do in the Austrian way for him not to get impeachment after him? Which is like, how would you implement Austrian measures without having the president being taken away from office?
Well, the first thing I would tell him is to resign. And I mean, of course, I'm trying to make a joke, but also in all seriousness, I mean, that's, for those of you who don't know Robert Higgs, he had a theory about regime uncertainty, and the business people distrusted Franklin Roosevelt, in the 1930s because Roosevelt's rhetoric was very anti-business. And the true recovery didn't really begin until after Roosevelt was dead and Harry Truman was in there. And so partly it's because World War II was ending, but also just, a lot of the business people really believed that Roosevelt was trying to become a dictator. He was the first American president to serve more than 2 consecutive terms and so on. So it looked like he was trying to be like Stalin and Hitler, but, obviously more liberal because he was an American. And so a lot of the business people didn't trust him, and so that Robert Higgs says one of the necessary preconditions for genuine recovery was to get Roosevelt couldn't be in charge. And I think it's the same thing in the United States, I'm not kidding, that with Obama in charge there, I mean, a lot of it is even unfair. A lot of the crazy rhetoric from, people on the radio against Obama, it's not even fair, but the point is certain people literally think he is from the devil, like literally, like they believe that religiously. And so, I mean, it would be hard to get people to go back to normal with that sort of mentality. So the more serious answer to your question, I mean, I don't know whether it would be politically feasible. I think it would be, actually. In the United States, I mean, people are talking about austerity. There's what's called the Tea Party. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. So Americans are a lot more serious now about strict measures, and I think if somebody really did sit, like Rand Paul, for example, is saying, look, we have to cut spending $500 billion this year. And it's not, that would have been considered insane if he said that a year ago, but now a lot of people are saying, yeah, that sounds good, because it doesn't even eliminate our deficit. So, I mean, just massive budget cuts, and then I would tell the Federal Reserve, link the dollar back to gold and start, like as assets mature, don't keep rolling them over, don't keep buying more treasuries, either let the base shrink, or if you want, start stockpiling gold, so that investors believe the peg to gold, that you can back it up. But I mean, that's really the only thing you could do, and certainly stop, get rid of the healthcare legislation and all those other things that they're talking about. But I really think there's no magic solution. Just they have to cut spending drastically, and the way they could partially offset that is they could sell a bunch of assets that the federal government owns, a lot of mineral resources, oil and things like that. Just ironically, just so you guys know, when President Obama visited here recently, the thing that outraged a lot of people in the United States is he promised American taxpayer support for you guys to develop your offshore oil development, whereas he still has lots of regulations on U.S. companies not being able to drill off the United States. And so it's like U.S. taxpayers are paying the Brazilian government to help you develop your oil, but we can't, develop ours and we have to import it. So it's things like that.
What do you think about the behavioral economics, that if you say something and you keep saying that and people believe in that, might make an impact, a negative impact on the economy. So, for example, now we heard that it was a good thing to buy gold, and everybody start buying gold, and there will be a price point that it's doesn't make sense anymore to buy gold. And if you look to the economy, and we don't put a solution to this, we say that the best thing to do is to don't do anything. There will be a downturn and people will lose their jobs. This might cause a negative effect that will even worse the economy. And maybe if you say there's another chance, there's another way to do it, people will be more optimistic, and there will be a short end. And on the same way, when you see a global economy and with much more difficulties to predict than only for a country or an island, and as we talked before about the people buying dollars in US to lend in Brazil because have a much higher interest rate, and this doesn't make the same effect as Keynes would predict when he thought about that in 1929. What are those two impacts on American economy?
Okay, so I think I understood the first question. So are you saying that perhaps some of the reason for the malaise is like a self-fulfilling prophecy, that we've got Austrians and other critics saying, oh, this is awful, the end is near, go buy gold and guns and, you know, bottled water and Brazilian meat because we're just going to have a collapse? I mean, yeah, that's possible, but I think I'm more of a fundamental type person, that I think the reason the economy is bad is because they had bad policies. I don't think it's just psychology. I mean, that could explain some of it, but no, I think, especially in the longer run, that the economy will improve when they put the right policies in place. And I think one of the huge areas of uncertainty right now is monetary policy. Just the fact that we're having these debates about, you know, is the dollar going to be around in 10 years? I mean, that if you're a business person in the United States, you know, it's hard for you to plan. Like, should I open a new factory if you're not even sure what the currency is going to be in 10 years? And so I think it's things like that a lot of the Keynesians don't understand. So, I mean, I guess you could describe that as psychological, that it's, you know, it has to do with expectations. It's not about, you know, the tax rates this quarter. But again, in terms of making long-term investments, I mean, people are very, things have frozen up. And it's sort of paradoxical that in order to try to get people to invest more, you know, they stimulate more, they inflate more, but then it's that partly what is causing them to be so skittish or to be so reluctant to invest. So did I answer your question? Or at least one of them?
Yes. The other one, it's about, you know, the carry trade effects that's going on, or even the capital controls, and the other things like the governments are doing diverse things, and that's not contributing to any policy at all.
Yeah, so here, I mean, I like to blame Bernanke for everything. So like if I miss my flight tomorrow, it's going to be Bernanke's fault. But, so I'm a bit, what I don't like, I'm sort of embarrassed when what's happening, and I think, you know, because there's a lot of countries, I think Brazil, they're going to the IMF and saying, can we institute capital controls? Because look at these Americans, they're printing dollars like crazy. That would make our currency appreciate, but that will hurt our exports, and so can we just offset that? So there's, like China, for example, they pegged their currency to the dollar because in the late 90s, you know, there was the Asian contagion, we call it the United States, I don't know what you call it here, you know, Thailand, and they had currency crises, and so China thought they were being responsible, and they linked their currency to the dollar. And if you look at the exchange rate of the Chinese currency versus the U.S. dollar, it's very flat for several years there. And so there's like they had a dollar standard instead of a gold standard. And then now the U.S. is printing a bunch of money, and so naturally the Chinese currency would tend to appreciate, and they're not letting it. And so the Americans are mad at the Chinese for manipulating their currency. When what we're saying is, hey, we have the God-given right to debase our currency, and you should just accept it. How dare you inflate at the same rate we are? That's not fair. You know, so that seems kind of ridiculous to me. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I definitely think that a lot of what's happening around the world is that the U.S. is inflating, and then other central banks are just matching it so that their exports don't get hurt, and then that's what happens, all the central banks that are inflating in unison, and that masks partly what's going on, because it looks like, oh, well, our currencies aren't changing, so what's the big deal? When, well, no, we're all inflating and it could all blow up in our faces.
Bom, vai ser servido agora café ali no hall. We're going to serve a coffee break,
One last
but it will
question,
be...
please. Last question.
Não, desculpa, agora estourou. The coffee break will be kind of vegetarian, because don't worry, ok? Então nós convidamos e daí a gente volta para o último painel com Hans Hermann Hoppe. Até breve, meia hora.